welcome to both of you, and I will hand over to you and your presentations. I'm going to start with Sue from Social Care Wales.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Whilst we're waiting for the slides to come up, just wanted to share with you, this is not a Social Care Wales presentation, but it's my own personal reflections. And some of the terminology that I may use may seem a bit outdated at the current time, but it's hopefully it will set the context of some of the little history I'm going to share with you. I've deliberately described this as why is it this way, and hopefully in a couple of minutes I just want to share with you how we've ended up with social care being in one part of the system and healthcare being in another. And all of you will be very familiar with the NHS and the launch of the NHS in 1948, and we've recently celebrated 75 years of the NHS, which is fantastic, and we all love the NHS. But what we're less familiar with is the 1948 National Assistance Act, which established things like the Education Act, Public Health Acts, Housing Acts, and also the start of roles for local government in looking at the health and well-being of their population. So I've deliberately put that little arrow there for you. Is social care need more important than a healthcare need? And if some of you are familiar possibly with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and Maslow told us that our most fundamental need is warmth, shelter and food. So when you think about who are the key workers in terms of the COVID pandemic, was it the health service? Was it social care workers? Or was it indeed people who are filling the shelves in our shops for food, and those drivers taking food around, and other public services? And on this slide, I've included two pictures. One is a Holly Care home, they're fictitious. The other is a Bury hospital. And the reason I've put them on there is to show how similar some of the buildings may be. And again, they're a product of our history. Before we had the NHS, we had what were called work houses or poor houses, and anyone who needed a health care treatment had to pay for it, and you'll know this. But when the National Assistance Act came into fruition, it almost had two arms. One was about social security, which was about money. The other arm was social services and the development of social services. And that social services was about providing support to people who may be vulnerable for a range of issues. And then in the 1980s, so I'm whizzing forward quite a few years now, we had what was called at that time mental handicap legislation. And we wouldn't use that phrase today, but that was a recognition that people with many vulnerabilities were being homed or housed in NHS institutions. And obviously we started to realise that many of those people could live quite independent lives, quite usefully on their own. And then in the 1990s, we had what was called the NHS and Community Care Act. And again, that was a UK legislation. And because we weren't a devolved administration in Wales at that time. So you can see how life has moved and changed. And that act transferred care and accommodation and welfare support from the NHS into local government, and the growth of the NHS came. Bringing us right up to date now with the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. We now really emphasise how people need to be empowered and supported to live a life that matters to them. And the whole ethos of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, as we'll find out through the week, is to really try and empower. And I've got there that little phrase, message to protect the NHS. One of the things that happened, I think, in terms of COVID, because we all love the NHS and really value it, if you remember, Clap for Carers was initially all about the NHS. Then we started to talk about social care workers. And then eventually we recognised that there were other key workers in the system, that we also needed to support. And I think we can demonstrate the commitment and professionalism of the social care workforce as we were going through that pandemic. And certainly there were some colleagues in the social care frontline who were even sleeping in the care homes to protect their loved ones and the people they support in the care homes. Next slide, please. So, you know, I think there may be a network connection. No? Okay, we're all right. We've got the next slide up. That's great. So I've highlighted there in particular regulating the social care workforce because that's one of the attempts Welsh Government is trying to do to raise the qualifications and the standards within the social care workforce in a similar way to doctors and nurses are currently regulated. And I think building on, you know, our COVID experience, what Welsh Government is trying to do now is to make sure no one is left behind. COVID has exposed great inequalities across society. And, you know, there were higher numbers of social care workers who died from COVID than there were health workers. And when I saw that statistics, I was quite surprised. But I think that's the reality of the frontline workforce working in social care. When you think about children in particular and Social Services and Wellbeing Act, for children, social services is very much focused on child protection and safeguarding. The courts will decide ultimately whether parents are fit enough to look after their own children. If they're not, they become a looked after child and come into the state system. And if you just think about that for a minute, that is one of the hardest decisions that qualified social workers have to make, working with the courts. People don't do that lightly. So it's, you know, a tough job out there. So the premise of the Act is trying to turn those intentions that I'm sure Gwenda would have shared with you this morning into reality. And, you know, we're on that journey of really trying to empower citizens using things like direct payment. So, you know, a question for me, for you to pause and think about is, why is the uptake not as high as in other parts of the UK? So I think, you know, that's a question for us. And we're in a process now of regulating the social care workforce. When I first became the chief exec, we had about 12,000 on our register. We're now up to over 30,000. And, you know, people have views on whether that's the right thing to do or not the right thing to do. But Wales has decided this is what we're doing. And interestingly, other parts of the UK are starting to follow suit, and some already are regulating. But then again, I pose that question for you. Should everyone be registered, including personal assistants, you know, employed through the direct payment system? There are some people who have strong views, they should be. There are others who have strong views, they shouldn't be. Because once you regulate, you have to establish what are the qualification requirements, what is the code of professional conduct that we expect those regulated workers to follow. And it does mean that you improve consistency, you raise quality, but what you may lose potentially is that local flexibility and meeting individual people's needs. And I think, you know, when Eve shares her presentation with you, her conversation, those are the things we have to balance. What do we want to regulate for on a national basis? Where do we want that local freedom? And the other thing I think that everyone is aware of now is the disparity in terms and conditions between the social care frontline workforce and frontline workers in the NHS. And I think COVID has taught us that they're equally valuable and we should be recognising them in an equal way. Next slide, please. So who decides? And this is where, you know, citizen voices are absolutely fundamental. We elect who represents us, both at the Welsh Government, the Senedd, also at a UK level, and also in your local authority. So for me, I think there's a real opportunity for you as citizen representatives to hear from the witnesses this week, construct a really good, powerful report with some key recommendations for the Welsh Government and other organisations, including Social Care Wales, if you think that's appropriate, and really start to think about who is it who's prioritising social care. And we know that there is never enough money to go around, but let me just share some statistics with you that you may find interesting. So currently the NHS spends nearly 50% of Welsh Government's budget. Within that 50%, 74% of that money is spent on acute hospital and medicines. So 4% is spent on what they call secondary prevention and 2% on early intervention and primary prevention. So we could say we're really funding an illness service, not a health service. And if you think about social care, it's one of the areas which are fundamental to preventing people becoming sicker, iller, more vulnerable, and keeping them out of the hospital system. So if you look at it purely on an economic basis, if you don't fund social care well, the NHS will suffer and will become overwhelmed. And we've seen some of those challenges that the NHS has had during COVID, how we really are dependent on care homes and care at home being really well provided to keep as many people as possible out of that hospital system. And we know that some of the political parties are thinking about should social care be merged with the NHS? Should we have a national care service? And I'm sure that as we go into the preparations for next year's Welsh elections, we'll hear from the various parties what their proposals are. And I think, it'd be good for the citizens panel to think about what are the risks and benefits. And, I've thought of a few myself, but you may think of others, particularly as you end this jury at the end of the week. I've mentioned national, regional and local already. But one of the things the NHS does well is, really sets national standards, has almost a one-size-fits-all approach. We've got a different approach in social care because we're trying to aspire to meeting people's needs and meeting the needs of our local communities. And that's why social care fits well within a local government context, because all those other elements of social determinants like leisure, education, housing, they fit neatly and they're focused on that citizen population. Thank you, David. So again, if you think about a national care service, again, there may be benefits in having a national one-size-fits-all and standards. But what you may lose is that individual and local responsiveness that we are really trying to push forward in terms of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. So it's your chance to influence decision makers and use your sessions on the jury really well and think about, okay, what is it you would like to say to a future Welsh Government and to other public bodies to help ensure that we make the right decisions and to do the best we can to support and improve the development of social care in Wales. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we're handing over to Eve now before we do questions. Thank you.
That's right. That's correct. Thank you, Sue. And Eve.
I'm working on it. Am I there?
Yeah, you're there. Great.
Sorry, everyone. I can't get this on my laptop, so I'm having to use my tablet and hold it up in front of me. So I'll try to stay steady. Okay, when Katie asked us and the Measuring the Mountain Steering Group asked us to do this presentation or have this conversation, it was I was told it was about talking about the challenges that we face here in social care and social services. So I thought that the easiest way to do it was actually talk through what is quite a typical and normal situation for us, and not just for Monmouthshire, but it'll be the same across Wales. So I sent out everybody a scenario which is based on real life about a lady that we'll call Mrs. Jones. So Mrs. Jones is an 83-year-old lady, and she came into hospital after a fall following an ambulance call out. She lives on her own in a small village about 10 miles from Abergavenny. She has a son who is very supportive, but he lives in America. So before going into hospital, Mrs. Jones didn't have any support from social services or the health service. She has friends in the village who she sees regularly. She goes to church. She loves gardening. She's got a cat called Tom. So after being in hospital for a couple of weeks, it's been decided that Mrs. Jones is ready to leave the hospital, and she is very much looking forward to going home and doing all the things that she used to do. So while she was in hospital, she had a few tests done, started on some new medications, but it was decided by Mrs. Jones and others that it would be a good idea if she had some support when she got home. She's quite worried about falling at home, which is very realistic because, you know, the evidence shows that once somebody's had a fall, there's quite a high likelihood that there's a high likelihood that they might fall again. She is a bit wobbly on her feet, and she's not confident that she's going to be able to do all the things that she usually does. And also, while she's been in hospital for a couple of weeks, she hasn't been doing that much, so she feels a bit weaker and a little bit more vulnerable. So the plan is that she'll go home with support from ReAblement. Now in Monmouthshire, as with quite a lot of other boroughs across Wales, ReAblement is a joint service. So people in ReAblement are employed by both the local authority and the health board, so they work closely together. And ReAblement is supported by our in-house carers. So in Monmouthshire, we have in-house domiciliary carers, paid carers, who either work for ReAblement or they work in longer term care. So those that work in ReAblement will be going out with the occupational therapists and the physiotherapists and the social workers to support and enable people to get better again and get back to what they were doing before. And then the longer term domiciliary service is for people who've got more complex needs or who are end of life. So it's decided that Mrs. Jones will have some ReAblement when she goes home, but there isn't any capacity in ReAblement at the moment. So why have we got no capacity in ReAblement at the moment? So there's a few just to name some of them. So one is that we generally have an increase in need or an increase in demand. So on average, year on year, we have had about 8% more referrals. So you can see there already how the demand is outstripping the capacity that we have. We haven't had extra resources and we haven't had extra budget to cope with that increase in demand. Of course, we try and be as creative and innovative as we can to keep the service going, but there are times when we're operating a waiting list. We've also had over recent years what's called intermediate care funds. I'm not sure if everyone will have heard of them, but that's been funding from the Welsh Government to support specific initiatives or projects or service models. Now, these have been great in one hand, in that they've given us the opportunity to try things out. They've given us the opportunity to test out new ideas. However, the downfalls are, one is that intermediate care funds can't be used for core services. They have to be used for new things. So when your core services is failing, it can be a challenge to bring in new ideas. Also, the funding is short term, and the expectation is that we will, if they're successful models, we will somehow be able to absorb those into what we deliver on a day-to-day basis. That obviously is going to be a significant challenge. And one of the other problems is that we haven't always been able to get staffing because, again, it's short-term funding and they're temporary posts. So the increase in need has been a significant problem, but also so has the increase in complexity. So over recent years, we've seen more and more people who are coming with more and more problems. You know, we have an aging population, so we have more people who've got several comorbidities or several problems. So it's not unusual to see somebody who, like Mrs. Jones, has had a fall, might have some heart problems, might have arthritis, might have dementia. So we see more and more people with complex problems. So of course, with more complexity, then those people need more support and need more time. And also, people more and more these days want to go home. They, 5-10 years ago, we saw more people going into residential and nursing homes. We see less of that now. We see more people who want to, quite rightly, stay in their own homes. In Monmouthshire, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Monmouthshire, but we also have the problems with, not a problem, it's great on one hand when you're going out climbing up in a mountain on a Sunday, but the rurality that we have in our borough also causes significant problems, as it does in many places across Wales. So if Mrs. Jones is going home and she's going to, as part of her ReAblement package, have 3 calls a day, those calls are 30 minutes each. She lives 10 miles outside of Abergavenny. The calls aren't 30 minutes. The calls are 30 minutes, but the actual time needed and the capacity needed from the team is a half an hour travelling each way and a 30-minute call. So it's actually an hour and a half 3 times a day. And on top of that, we've also got the issues that we all, or many of us, experienced last year. So that 10 miles away from Abergavenny is not 10 miles down a dual carriageway. It's 10 miles down a windy road that floods, that gets, problems with snow, etc., etc. And then one of the biggest issues we had, and Sue talked a little bit about this before, is recruitment. So recruiting into social care is a never-ending challenge. So it's not about the money, it's actually about getting the right resources and finding people who want to come in to these jobs. So currently in Monmouthshire, we are down about 800 hours per week. So we have got people waiting for hours for support at home that amount to 800 hours a week. So we are actively recruiting all the time. We currently have 27 vacancies and we are interviewing on Wednesday 16 people. So, hopefully some of those are successful. I keep my fingers crossed that some of those are successful and that they're suitable for the job, but that still leaves us a significant gap. We constantly trying to recruit to domiciliary care jobs, and I think there's a whole host of reasons why we struggle with that. So for the rurality is an issue, affordable housing in places like Monmouthshire is an issue, the fact that people need to have a car to be able to do the job in somewhere like Monmouthshire is an issue. If you're a young person looking for a job in care, driving, affording a car, etc. So there's a lot of issues as to why it's a difficult job. And then also when you know that an area is struggling and has got such a shortfall like we have, then you know that the job is going to be, although very rewarding, it's going to be very hard. So bearing all that in mind, and those are just a few of the challenges that we face, not just day by day, hour by hour. Mrs. Jones is now a delayed transfer of care from hospital. So that brings a whole host of other problems. So with that weekly pressure that we have, you've got this number of people that you can't get out of hospital. What are you going to be doing about them? Can you put them into a home as an alternative? And one thing that is worth, I think, that we need to think about, and there needs to be much more of going forward, is not necessarily about integrating health and social care, but is working much more closely together. So, a primary question for me, and for the jury to think about is, did she really need to go into hospital in the first place? We know that when people go into hospital, they deteriorate significantly. So the Mrs. Jones, just before she went into hospital, would probably have been easier to get her back on her feet and rehabilitate her than Mrs. Jones, who's been in hospital for 2 weeks, not doing a lot, being in an unfamiliar environment, and all those sorts of things have a huge impact, particularly on older people. So,
Eve,
yeah.
it's time to start wrapping up if you can now, Eve.
Yeah, that's it. I am finished. So that's just my final thought is, did she need to go into hospital in the first place, and do we need to have a lot more thoughts in the future about how we coordinate and have those resources in the community, not in the acute setting? I'm done. Thank you.